has certainly been a difficult and controversial one. And so to help our member companies understand what they can and can't mandate, we've been working with Norm Keith from KPMG Law to help us wade through some of the murk and to help us, stay up to date as things continue to evolve on this issue, because they are evolving day by day, and it seems almost hour by hour. So Norm has put together a template policy that companies can use as a guideline when they're developing their own company policies. And he's going to speak to some of these issues and the nuances that are developing around implementing this type of policy in your workplace. I want to thank Stephen Crombie for putting this webinar together and for leading the way on the development of this template policy from our side that we're going to be talking about this morning. For those who still have not had the opportunity to meet Stephen, he is our new-ish manager of government and public relations. He's been here since the spring. And I'm going to turn things over to him to get us rolling. So thank you, everybody, for attending, and make sure to visit our website to download the policy template and to reach out to us if you have any questions. Okay, so Stephen, over to you.
Great, thanks, Patrick. And it's nice to virtually meet everyone. I look forward as we get past this, we get to have more in-person events. So I'm really looking forward to it. Look, obviously, considering the recent announcements from government officials, vaccination policies have become top of mind for all industries in the province. And so we hope you'll find this webinar useful and informative. On September 1st, the Government of Ontario announced that it will be introducing a proof of vaccination system that will be required for individuals to access specific businesses. This new system will take effect on September 22nd and will stay in place for as long as deemed necessary under the Reopening Ontario Act. So in early June, as Patrick mentioned, the OSWCA retained the services of Norm Keith of KPMG Law to develop a workplace vaccination policy template available for all of our members. The purpose of the vaccination policy template is to encourage vaccinations across our industry and to help stop the spread of COVID-19. While construction is not included in the list of businesses under the Reopening Ontario Act, the OSWCA intends to make it as easy as possible for our members to achieve compliance in the event this list expands to our industry or proof of vaccination becomes a condition of contract. Our presenter today is Norm Keith, as Patrick mentioned. Norm is a partner at KPMG Law, and he is a management side employment lawyer. Most notably, he is one of the leading occupational health and safety lawyers in Canada. Norm has successfully defended more than 1,000 occupational health and safety related regulatory and criminal related charges. Norm's advisory practice includes, but is not limited to, executive compensation, employment contracts, HR policies, and COVID-19 vaccination policies. I'll just note, there is a question and answer portion of the webinar after Norm's presentation. So please input any questions you have into the question box and we will be sure to answer them. Thank you again, Norm, for making yourself available today for this very important issue. Thanks.
Thank you, Patrick and Stephen. I think it's great that the association is taking the leadership and initiative to address this issue, to have a draft vaccination policy available for its members as part of the benefits of membership, and also to invite people to this, this webinar. What we're going to do is provide a little bit of an overview, a little bit of context, and a little bit of legal guidance today on the whole subject of vaccination policies in the workplace. So there's a lot of material to cover. We'll get right into it, and here we go. So worldwide, we know we're in a pandemic. There's been over 222 million cases around the world and over 4.5 deaths. That's a terrible, terrible disease, and it's not obviously going away soon. In Canada, we have over 1.5 million cases and over 27,000 deaths. In Ontario alone, there are over 28,000 workers' compensation cases that have been allowed by the WSIB for COVID-related outbreak transmission in a workplace and 7 recorded deaths. So this is serious. It's important to be aware of this as not only a public, but also a workplace or occupational health crisis. Now, the only real comparator in recorded modern history is the Spanish flu, and there are some lessons to be learned. About a third of the world was infected back in 1918 and 1919. About 35 to 50 million people died. In Canada, there was over 50,000 deaths. And the major difference, because the viral transmission and the lethality of the virus of the Spanish flu is very comparable to COVID-19, the major difference is they didn't develop a vaccine, and antivirals for treatment once you got the vaccine were not available. Keep that in mind. That's the only major difference when you have a third of the world sick and 35 to 50 million people dying. And in Canada, which had a much smaller population at the time, 50,000 dead. So this is serious. Health Canada has approved 4 vaccines. Only 3 are available. The single dose Johnson & Johnson is not, for reasons we don't need to go into. The World Health Organization, and supported by Health Canada, has taken the position that with the nature of this virus, especially in the Delta variant, we need at least or a minimum of 85% of the total population to be vaccinated. So currently, we have 66.8% of Canadian population fully vaccinated. 76.4% of Canadians, or working age group Canadians of 12 and over, have been vaccinated. But it's unclear if or how Canada will achieve herd immunity. So that becomes the dilemma. This is not going to go away or be effectively under control until we have population or herd immunity. That's what the science tells us. And we only have, 66.8% of the community vaccinated. This is a problem. So what do we know? Well, we know that the vaccinations have been scrutinized and approved by Health Canada. Health Canada is the equivalent of the FDA in the US that you may have heard about on American television. Canadian Medical Association, that your doctor and mine belongs to, recommends that physicians encourage patients to get the vaccine, and even if there is hesitancy, to talk to their doctor. Don't go to the dark web and get a conspiracy theory about mRNA vaccines controlling your mind or your body, which is foolishness, but go to your doctor. Rely upon medical advice if you're worried, confused, or hesitant. Now, federal and provincial governments have said they're strongly encouraging, but have not legislated any requirements for vaccination. 2 days before the federal government was announced by the Liberal Party, they said if re-elected, the federal government will take initiatives within their employment relationships with public sector employees to compel the mandatory vaccination, although we haven't seen legislation. So we don't know if that's a sincere promise, given that there's an election on. And we don't know what that'll look like. So it's nice to say you're in favor of mandatory vaccines. It's a little harder to do, but we're going to address those issues as we go. Currently, as you may or may not know, there are a number of statutes, federal and provincial, that mandate vaccines that have been fully approved, not like the COVID vaccines, which are simply for emergency use at the present time. The FDA, of course, 2 weeks ago announced that the Pfizer mRNA vaccine has now been taken off of temporary and emergency use and is now fully approved. So that permits it to then be put into legislation as a mandatory vaccine mandate. So for example, there are 7 mandatory vaccines for school children to prove through an immunization card that they have got from their family physician or a clinic before they're allowed to go to school. So the idea of government by law requiring certain vaccines to be required to do something like go to school is not unknown in Canadian law. This is a bit of a chart that was given out in an ABA conference that I attended, used with permission. What is really key, and it's a little small, I'm going to put my glasses on to read it. What is the protection from these 5 vaccinations that were considered by the FDA for somebody getting COVID. Well, that's the right-hand column. And they vary a little bit, but not material from an immunization benefit perspective. Then third from the right, what is the protection from hospitalization and death? So if there are no comorbidity risk factors, i.e. quite old, quite obese, quite diabetic, having dementia, those are some of the key comorbidity risk factors the science tells us that COVID works with, then essentially the vaccine is going to be as close to 100% as you can from getting really sick, going to the hospital, or dying. Bottom line, the vaccines are carefully vetted, carefully approved, well tested, and safe to take, and they work. So some of the challenges, though, that employers are facing with vaccine encouragement is this whole idea of hesitancy. I make the distinction, and there's some distinction in the medical and psychological literature between vaccine hesitancy and a committed anti-vaxxer. Just want to deal with this briefly, because in your workplaces, you're probably going to have some vaccine hesitancy of employees and maybe, but hopefully not, an anti-vaxxer. So vaccine hesitancy is not an unintelligent position to take. It's saying, look, I'm not sure about the vaccines. I'd like to have some more information about how they were developed. I don't really trust government because for whatever personal reason, the vaccine hesitancy says, well, I don't know if their approval processes are legitimate or scientifically valid. What is interesting and phenomenal is that Health Canada, who approved the vaccines in Canada, has published all of the test results from all of the large sample size tests for all the vaccines that have been approved in Canada. And you might call me boring, but I read those and it's impressive. You can also find out what is the net adverse effect of all or individual vaccines on that same Health Canada website. And what you'll see is that there is a 0.005%. So 5 chances in 100,000 of having anything other than a sore arm when you get the vaccine. It's much lower in terms of its likelihood of an adverse effect on a person that is a temporary effect than many medications people are on and many other personal choices people make. So the risk associated when you put it into a relative, comparative, numerical, or percentage risk is so small compared to the benefits, there really is no comparison. So that helps perhaps with vaccine hesitancy. Another thing is going to talk to the doctor that the person trusts. So if you have people saying, I don't know if I should get the vaccine, say, you know what, I respect your hesitancy or your caution. However, time is moving on, business has to move on. We would like you to talk to your doctor. And if you come back with a doctor's note saying you have a medical reason why you can't get vaccinated, that's one thing. But if you come back, your doctors encourage you to get vaccinated and you now have moved from vaccine hesitancy to the committed ideological and fundamentally irrational position of being an anti-vaxxer, that's a different story. So you're not likely to persuade anti-vaxxers to change their mind. And you may or may not have any of them working with you. We'll deal with that later in the presentation, but vaccine hesitancy is reasonable and can be dealt with by definition, and anti-vaxxer ideological commitment cannot. So let's look at the legal artwork, or the legal framework for vaccine policies. Well, we know that the Occupational Health and Safety Act has a super seniority or quasi-constitutional clause. So section 2.2 of the Ontario Occupational Health and Safety Act says the provisions of this act and regulations prevail over other statutes or laws. Essentially what it's saying is that workplace or occupational health and safety is a primary or paramount legal responsibility for employers. Then we have an interesting obligation on the part of workers. So as you probably know, the Occupational Health and Safety Act is governed and inspired by this idea of internal responsibility. So there is a shared responsibility between employers, supervisors, and workers for safety of not just themselves, but everyone on the job site. So it makes sense that Section 28(2)(b) says a worker must not, so it's a legal duty, it's not discretionary, it's mandatory, work in a manner that may endanger any other worker. So it's a general provision, but what it means in the context of COVID, in my view, is that a worker has no right to force their anti-vaxxer attitude and refusal to be vaccinated on co-workers and perhaps members of the public. Or to put it another way, this is a prohibition against a worker coming to work in defiance of a mandatory proof of vaccine policy. The worker themselves is breaking the law. The worker themselves might be the subject of censure by the Ministry of Labor, and also concern about work refusals from other workers who are aware of their vaccination status. So I think what has been missed in a lot of the debate is that there is a shared responsibility by workers as well as employers for the safety of those in the workplace. And because the medical evidence indicates that vaccination is much more effective than the combination of access screening, masking, and physical distancing, and often cleaning of frequently touched surfaces, that the vaccines are a better prevention measure for the safety of workers, then you get to the conclusion that there's a legal mandate, or can be a legal mandate, for mandatory vaccine in the workplace. So employers and supervisors have this general duty clause that says they must take every reasonable precaution in the circumstances for the protection of workers. So the question from the legal compliance perspective is, if I don't require mandatory proof of vaccine in my workplace, am I taking every precaution reasonable in the circumstances? People at this point often jump up and say, yes, but I have a right to this, and I have a right not to be told what to do. And we'll deal with those concerns in a minute. But we're not talking about individual rights versus society. We're talking about the employer and the supervisor's legal obligation to take every precaution reasonable for the protection of workers in a workplace. Of course, employers are the primary target for enforcement. There's a lot of enforcement coming back. Ministry of Labor is doing less COVID-related work refusals, less COVID compliance program and policy reviews, and more enforcement now. There's a bit of a catch-up because of the 6-month suspension of limitation period. So this early fall, we're seeing a lot of aggressive enforcement for traditional health and safety issues, as well as COVID safety plan compliance problems. The penalty for an employer, $1.5 million per counter charge. The average number of counts in my experience is 4. And about 65 to 70% of the time when we see corporations or businesses charged, we also see individuals, whether it be supervisor, director, or officer, or all of them charged. They have risk of going to jail in a severe case and $100,000 maximum fine. So when we're talking about legal risk related to COVID, we're talking about risk of being prosecuted, convicted, and having these penalties under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. So if an employer wants to have a COVID vaccine policy, are they allowed to? Should they? Well, before we get to the content of this slide, let me remind you that by law for over a year now, every employer in Ontario under the public health legislation and a regulation passed under it, there needs to be a COVID safety plan. I've talked to clients as early as this week, or as recently as this week, that still don't have a COVID safety plan. It doesn't have to be long, it doesn't have to be complex, but please, if you don't have a COVID safety plan in place, you've been breaking the law for about a year, you need to get one. COVID's not going away. And if you have an incident or a whistleblower and the Ministry of Labor comes in your site, that's the first thing they're asking for now. So when we talk about a vaccine policy, it might be part of your COVID safety plan, or it might be a standalone policy. It doesn't really matter the format or where it sits, but it is something that we strongly recommend clients consider. So COVID really to avoid legal liability needs to be addressed not only in a COVID safety plan, but you have to deal with the issue of what is our vaccine policy. Public health measures are good and maybe also augmenting a vaccine policy, but a vaccine policy is critical. Why? Well, because of that general duty clause requirement, but also because of the defense of due diligence. So bear with me as I go through an example. So I have a client who has had a worker contract COVID, very likely contract COVID at work, and has subsequently died. They're getting workers' compensation benefits to the family, and there's a Ministry of Labor ongoing investigation. If the Ministry of Labor concludes that the employer could have, but did not have a mandatory proof of vaccine policy, but left it up to people's honor and discretion, is that going to be sufficient to prove a due diligence defense? In other words, due diligence is the defense for a health and safety related charge or a charge under the Westray bill, the criminal negligence causing death by a workplace hazard. So the question that is not yet answered in any Canadian case, but eventually will be, in my opinion, is the failure of an employer to have a mandatory proof of vaccine policy, but simply an encouragement for workers to get vaccinated and an honor system, we're not going to track who's vaccinated and who's not, and crossing of the proverbial fingers, is that a due diligence defense? Well, in my experience, although there is no COVID case yet in Canada, so this is just extrapolating from general principles of due diligence law, is that that will not be sufficient to prove on a balance of probabilities that the employer took every precaution reasonable in the circumstances to prevent the hazard of COVID infecting a worker. So if you choose not to have a mandatory proof of vaccine policy, but merely strongly recommend it, and you don't track who's vaccinated and who isn't, in my view, generally speaking, you run the risk of legal liability much more so, and the risk of not being able to establish a due diligence defense than if you had a mandatory proof of vaccine policy. So some of the critical questions to ask, especially assuming a unionized work environment, is, can I require proof of vaccine? Is that a human rights violation? And if the answer is yes, I can, is there a human rights exemption and a related duty to accommodate? And even if the answer is no, I can't or don't want to have a mandatory proof of vaccination policy, should I have a policy of some sort at all? And of course, I've already said yes to that. Then what are the legal issues and what position should I take on it? Employers are asking. And, can a failure on the part of the employer to be quite focused on a mandatory proof of vaccine policy, will that be enough to establish a due diligence defense? And I've already given a general guidance comment that I don't believe it is. But let's deal with a few other issues. So there is arbitral jurisprudence, in other words, some arbitration case law or union collective agreements on sort of mask or vaccine rules by hospitals. This is in the context of seasonal flu. And what all the arbitrators are agreeing upon, and even in some of the early COVID cases are agreeing upon, is it's the KVP test, that's the name of a case, that really will provide guidance. And KVP has 6 elements. They're in the 3rd bullet point on the slide, but the key one from our perspective is the rule has to be not unreasonable. In other words, the best and gold standard, of course, is to get union buy-in, to get union cooperation, to get a joint management union policy about vaccination, whether it be recommended strongly or mandatory. If you can't get that from any of the trade unions you're dealing with, and they're reluctant they're kind of sitting on the fence on the issue, then you have a right under the management rights clause of your collective agreement to impose a mandatory management policy without union approval. To do so, though, however, successfully, and to survive an arbitral challenge, the KVP test must be met. So the question really becomes, is it not unreasonable, or to put it in normal language, not legalese, is it reasonable for employers to have a mandatory proof of vaccine policy And will that be something an arbitrator will uphold really becomes the issue that's not yet been resolved, but I'm sure soon or later will. In my view, generally speaking, in a workplace where there is from time to time congregate work setting where you're in close proximity, even if you're outdoors, there still is risk and sometimes significant risk of COVID transmission. And therefore, it is not unreasonable to have a mandatory proof of vaccine policy. Other precautions, masking, access, questionnaires, screening, and physical distancing are not the equivalent of a vaccination. The challenge as well is that the Delta variant is so much more transmissible, and it's easier to get even from somebody outside. So my little formula for trying to analyze on the KVP analysis on the last bullet is you've got COVID, it's highly transmissible, especially with the Delta variant. There is a high mortality and fatality rate. And then if you look at the vaccine efficacy, or its effectiveness in keeping people from getting sick and dying, and largely also from getting it, that would support, in my little formula, the idea of a mandatory proof of vaccine policy as being reasonable, or to use the KVP language, not unreasonable. So the severity of the infectious disease, the risk of communication, those are issues that evidence would have to be called in arbitration to support the policy. The past mask or vaccine jurisprudence is not very helpful. But I think the major issue for most employers these days is not the value of the vaccine or the advisability of it, it's litigation hesitancy. So I don't know if that is a phrase that's come up on your lexicon before, but litigation hesitancy is just really the worry or the fear on the part of the employers that, gee, we don't want to be the first in our industry to have to argue this case before a court or an arbitrator. I understand that. I am not advocating that you be a first adopter. But let's look at the history, and this was alluded to by both Patrick and Stephen at the outset of the webinar. Most of the major banks, well, I think all of them actually, had a discussion, obviously among themselves, and they came out 2 weeks ago with a mandatory proof of vaccine policy for employees and also potentially for customers who come in to see them. The same occurred with all the major law firms that are national law firms. The same is for all the major accounting firms, all the major airlines, all airlines actually for that matter in Canada. And although government hasn't required this, because it is more difficult to legislate this than it is to encourage employers to take on this policy, employers are in a difficult spot. Some are saying, well, I wish government would just pass a law allowing us to require mandatory proof of vaccine and be done with it. Here's the problem. That requires good leadership, calm leadership, non-political but policy-based leadership. Sadly, both federal and provincial, I don't believe we have that. But quite apart from that, it's quite clear it's a political issue. And politicians aren't going to stir it up, but for the Liberal Party, and we'll see if they can actually or will follow through if they remain in power after the federal election, about a commitment to require federally regulated employers to be vaccinated. That political hesitancy should not affect employer decision-making for what's best for your workers, what's safest for your workers. Because government, and this is somewhat maybe inconsistent or some might say hypocritical, government will hold you as an employer responsible for keeping the workplace safe. We've gone through those general duty clause provisions. So the point is, the law with respect to your obligations to keep workers safe is there. The means of keeping them safe through a mandatory proof of vaccine policy is now available with broader supply vaccine. There is litigation or first adopter reluctance, especially in the construction industry across Ontario, but there need not be if leading, collective, large number of employers, especially in the sewer water main industry, decide this is a best practice they're all going to adopt and support each other if there is litigation risk. So I think there is that hesitancy of litigation or dispute or conflict. There are other related labor market issues of concern. But remember, there is a legal basis upon which, in my view, to have mandatory proof of vaccine for the reasons I've stated. So the choice is going to be yours as an employer. Will you be a leader, or will you risk people at your workplace getting sick from COVID and risk legal enforcement, prosecution, workers' compensation costs and claims? That's the choice, really, that you're going to have to do individually, but also as an industry. So let's look at one of the leading cases. It's not a vaccine case, but how it was argued and what it stands for. So the Crescent Care Retirement Home decided that even though no one had tested positive, both staff and residents, for COVID, that they wanted to keep it that way. So they implemented rapid testing every 2 weeks for all their staff. This was grieved by a union, and the question was the KVP test. Was it reasonable to impose this requirement on staff? This is a pre-vaccine supply case. Was it reasonable, given that there were no COVID cases? In other words, one could argue that, look, our COVID protocols and safety procedures were working, so we haven't had a COVID outbreak in the workplace, so why bother? Or why be intrusive and do a nasal swab of staff through a registered nurse every 2 weeks? Well, the arbitrator listened to all those arguments of both sides and said this: the policy, to be consistent with the collective agreement through the management rights clause, has to be clear, unequivocal, and incorporated with some sort of accommodation requirement. But that because it's not disciplinary or blameworthy, but it's attempting to improve safety, then the balance of interest favored workplace and residents or public safety, and therefore the policy was upheld. So as we compare that case to the vaccine policy issue, the question becomes, if you have a mandatory proof of vaccine policy, is it reasonable as a means to protect workers the best way available? So the city of Hamilton is talking about requiring all people who contract with them, including sewer and water main work, to have in their commercial or construction contract proof of vaccine policies. Hospitals, when this won't so much apply to the audience on the video or webinar here, but hospitals are requiring service providers to confirm that all of their employees are fully vaccinated. And more entertainment venues, restaurants, etc., are imposing those rules, even if it's not a legal requirement from a government statute or regulation. So the idea is that health and safety law, yes, does support and give a legal framework, an argument in support of mandatory proof of vaccine. And it's something that provides evidence of the best practice for prevention for COVID transmission in the workplace. Now we get to the hot button issues. So people say, well, gee, yeah, but I have a human right. Don't I have a human right to not be vaccinated? Well, no, you don't. In Ontario, your vaccine status per se is not a disability. It's a fact. However, if indeed your doctor has given you a doctor's report or note that you cannot get a vaccine or should not get a vaccine because of some medical predisposition or allergic reaction, which is apparently a very, very small number of people, but they're out there. Unless you have medical objective evidence that you have a disability, i.e. a risk of a negative reaction to the COVID vaccine, there is not a protected ground under the human rights legislation, the Human Rights Code in Ontario, that would provide an exemption. I don't know if that comes as a shock to many, but there's a lot of mischief and misinformation and nonsense out there about human rights and privacy rights. So the bottom line is, yes, in your policy, you must provide for an exception to a mandatory proof of vaccine policy if a person has a disability and proof thereof. Now, I don't know if you've read about this in social media and mainstream media, but there's a growing level of fraud that workers are perpetrating on employers to say, yeah, my doctor says I can't get vaccinated. Be very careful if you get a proof of vaccine letter, make sure it's an original and get permission or consent from the person presenting it to verify it through the doctor. Like all things in life, any rules are going to be skirted by some. And so to avoid fraud or to avoid the person really lying to you, but using somebody else's vaccine, whiting it out or changing it on a software system and presenting as their own, you want to be alert to that, because a lot of anti-vaxxers are saying, oh, I know the way out of this. I'm going to get a fake vaccine exemption letter from my doctor. The mere fact that a person is an anti-vaxxer is not a protected ground of discrimination. That's the key point here. There may also be a very limited, sincerely held religious belief exemption. Whether it's that exemption or the physical disability from a doctor's letter, there is then a duty to accommodate, so not apply the good faith rule of requiring vaccination to the point of undue hardship. So if you can accommodate the person by working remotely or working in a remote part of your workplace, because they have a human rights exemption, then you need to do that. If they don't have a valid human rights exemption, you don't need to do that. It's quite simple. Now, the other issue is privacy. People have told me, and some lawyers even said, well, you know, we've got privacy laws. You can't do that. You can't ask for proof of vaccine. Well, if you hear that from a lawyer, make sure you don't hire that lawyer, because they're really not very capable. There is no Privacy Act in Ontario. A year ago, the government of Ontario talked about introducing one, but there is no Privacy Act. Now, there are some general common law and constitutional reasonable expectations of privacy, but they're always contextual. So from a privacy perspective, there's no privacy law prohibition against a mandatory proof of vaccine policy that's otherwise lawful. But to meet and to assuage the concerns and worries of your employees, you should look to the following concepts if you're collecting vaccine information or data. The first is always obtain written consent. Second, explain the method of collection, the purpose of use, and ultimately if you're going to disclose in what context. Also make sure the data is secure, and then commit to destroying that data effectively if, in effect, it's no longer necessary. In other words, we're through the pandemic. Once you take those steps and put them in your policy, there is no valid lawful reason for an employee to say, I don't think you're taking care of my privacy interests, because you in fact are. But there is no privacy law in Ontario that prohibits a mandatory proof of vaccine policy by an employer where workers are working in a congregate work setting in a lethal pandemic. Other accommodations that some clients are going with, and some are and some aren't, is considering vaccine incentives. You know, whether this is a bribe or an incentive, I'll leave it up to you to decide. I know the US, we've heard of lotteries. You know, if you get vaccinated, the state of Ohio will put you in the $1 million lottery. Seems to me to miss the point of the social responsibility that we all have living in a society to take care of ourselves and others if we can. The vaccines are free. You're not paying for them. There's no reason you can't go get one unless you have a medical reason that your doctor's advised you of. Another area is rapid testing. So is a rapid test a good alternative? That's what they're doing in the education system in Ontario. So if you're a teacher and you don't have mandatory proof of vaccine, you could provide a rapid antigen test. Well, I can tell you the antigen tests or the PCR tests, the more reliable tests, are much more invasive than a vaccination. And if you have to do it several times a week, or at least once a week if you're a teacher, I'm not sure of the exact timing, that to me seems more cumbersome and more costly to society than in fact just getting the vaccination. But those are means that other organizations other than in construction may want to consider, and construction may want to give that as a reasonable alternative or accommodation. But remember, lawful accommodation only follows a lawful exemption under human rights law, which is limited to disability or sincerely held religious belief. So what are the questions, just on the wrap up, that you should be thinking about? Well, is the policy consistent with my collective agreement, or if I'm non-union, my employment contracts? Usually it's going to be. Does the policy meet the KVP test? I would argue yes, but that will always be analyzed in a context in a particular workplace. What kind of proof of vaccination is available and acceptable? How will employers accommodate workers with exceptions? We've gone through that. How will employers protect the data they collect to assuage the concerns of privacy? And what are the consequences of refusal to follow the policy? Well, let's deal with that briefly. I think if the policy is clear, and if it's communicated well in advance of its implementation, and now that we have sufficient supply for everybody in society to get a vaccine, supply is not a reason or an excuse, then what should we do in terms of our policy? Well, at minimum, you should have a strong recommendation in your policy. And in that case, you're probably not going to do anything other than voluntarily collect vaccine status. If you go mandatory proof of vaccination policy, which is the more reliable and safety supportive policy that will provide better due diligence evidence if there ever is an outbreak, then you want to have it carefully drafted. And we've been doing that. I've been drafting COVID vaccine policies since early December of last year for clients in the healthcare industry who are having in commercial agreements mandatory proof of vaccine by all suppliers. In other words, all employees under a commercial contract with the hospital or the long-term care home must be vaccinated, which only makes sense because that's where people are often more vulnerable to the lethal effects of COVID. So that takes us to the end. I may have answered your questions or I may not have, but I'm happy to try and do that now. I think Stephen and Patrick, perhaps you've been monitoring the chat, and I will let you weed through and pick out the best questions and then present them to me, and I'll do my best to answer. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Norman, and thanks so much for the presentation. I think it really informs everyone on the call here today on what the options, obligations, and the need for a vaccination policy are. So not too many questions, so I think we can get through them pretty quickly. But I will start with Melanie. So the question is, are we able to receive a copy of this PowerPoint? Is part one of the question. And does the chart, I believe it was on slide 3, the chart that shows the efficacy of the different vaccines represent variants or just the normal COVID?
Good question. Yes, the PowerPoints are prepared for the benefit of the members of the association, so I have no problem with those being made available. The chart, full disclosure, was from an American Bar Association presentation given in June of this year. That was predating the surge of the Delta variant. There is, I believe, under the CDC, more recent data, but I think the interesting point about vaccines are twofold. One, they may be declining in not effectiveness for the Delta variant, but they may be declining in the effectiveness of the vaccine per se over time. So it's interesting that the Pfizer first approval of non-emergency use in the FDA is also turning out to be the vaccine that seems to fade in its effectiveness over time the quickest compared to the other two available in Canada, Moderna and AstraZeneca. I am not a vaccine expert or virologist. I think technical questions about vaccine effectiveness with respect to the Delta variant, there's a lot of data out there, seem to indicate that it's the high transmissibility more than the higher degree of lethality of the Delta variant. There's just many more people getting sick because of it, or getting exposed and getting sick because of it if they don't have the vaccine. So I think if there are medical questions about the effectiveness of the vaccine, either at an employer level, you can talk to an occupational health doctor or nurse, or you can look at some of the data yourself on the Health Canada website. But as much as there may be nuances or slight variations on effectiveness or slight variations on length of effectiveness, I think listening to and following public health guidance is a reliable way to, as an employer, understand the continuing value and maybe updating of information on vaccines. So you've heard about the Pfizer third dose or a booster shot. Booster shots are not unusual for other types of vaccines, such as the vaccine against polio, the vaccine against shingles. And so public health guidance and medical personnel, including your family doctor, will be a better place to get answers than from the American Bar Association chart or than from me.
Okay, perfect. And I think, Norm, for this next question, we may have addressed it throughout the presentation, but the question is, how can we track who has been vaccinated? Are we permitted to ask this information?
Excellent question. In my opinion, yes, you can ask the question. Asking a person for their vaccine status and recording it in a secure, non-accessible to the general staff of your company workplace is critical. For example, collecting the date. You don't need to know the vaccine type, in my opinion. You need proof of the date. If you see proof of the date, you're probably going to see the type of vaccine they got. Then you need to note that date, because all the vaccines essentially are not fully effective until the second dose plus 14 days. So there are two sort of best practices for collecting vaccine data. One is to actually get a copy, electronically or hard copy, of the proof of the second dose. We don't have one dose Johnson & Johnson available in Canada, so Moderna, Pfizer, and AstraZeneca all are 2 dose. So get proof of the second dose. It'll say second dose on it. That's the Health or Ontario Health protocol, and the date. So once you get that, you either keep that and make a record of it, or you have a demonstration, either in person or virtually, of the person showing you the information, and you check a box in your personnel files to say, I have observed and the worker has attested to the fact that they've got proof of vaccination. Some people like that second method rather than collecting it and keeping it, partly because you keep less information and it seems to be a little bit more worker friendly than actually the worker handing over the electronic or the physical document to the employer to keep. Either way, I think, yes, if you require it, you can ask for it. You should always get a signed consent form. There's a draft consent form to the model vaccine policy that we provided the association. And we do that just so there's no allegations of collecting personal health data without the consent of the employee. If a person says, well, I'm vaccinated, but I don't give you consent to know that fact, well, you don't know that they're vaccinated. Think about this. You're driving down the road and a police officer stops you and asks for your license and insurance. And you say, well, officer, I have my license and insurance, but I'm just not going to show you. And the officer will say again, well, yes, I'm not saying you're dishonest, driver, but I am saying I have a right to see proof. We live in an evidence and proof-based society, as we should. It's nice to trust people, but like Ronald Reagan famously said, trust but verify. So that's all you're doing. You're trusting your employees that they're vaccinated if they say they are, but you want to see and get a copy of it, or at least have an attestation that you record for the date and the confirmation it's a second dose, because you want to verify. It's reasonable, and your verification is your evidence of due diligence that, heaven forbid, somebody gets sick or dies in your workplace from a COVID exposure. You're going to need to show you were doing what you said you were doing in the policy. People get really worked up about vaccinations and being told what to do, and I get it. I don't like big government personally, but when you see how many Canadians have suffered and died because of COVID, when you hear so many cases of people now in ICU or on their deathbed saying, I wish I would have got vaccinated, And so many of those people got COVID from an unknown source. So it's highly transmissible. It's potentially deadly. And quite honestly, workers don't have a right to not be vaccinated, come to work and spread the disease at work. So although there may or may not be a constitutional right not to be forced by the government to get vaccinated, employers don't have that luxury in their best efforts to keep their workplace safe. So that's the key focus. Safety in the workplace, the best, highest practice in a pandemic, of course, is a proof of vaccine policy.
Perfect. The next question is, what if the what if the employee refuses to disclose the status of vaccination? What remedy does the employer have?
Well, if there's not a medical or sincerely held religious exemption, you have no legal duty to attempt to accommodate the worker's refusal. You may choose to accommodate the worker's refusal, even though they don't have a legal right to impose that on you. That's your choice. However, you may say this, well, I am sorry, but we are not going to be able to have you continue to work. We'll give you a temporary layoff as defined under the Employment Standards Act until you've decided to change your mind or the pandemic's over. And after 35 weeks, if we carry your benefits, we don't have to, then you will be permanently terminated. So it's not a blameworthy termination or layoff. You're not blaming the worker for the COVID pandemic or the necessary vaccine policy to deal with the risk, but you are establishing it as a firm and fixed temporary term and condition of employment that is for the important purpose of workplace safety. So ultimately, the employee will be let go. Now, whether temporary layoff will be considered a constructive dismissal in a non-union setting has not been litigated yet, but the answer might be yes. But then you get into the counter argument of, well, maybe I have just cause to terminate an employee who refuses without good lawful reason to be vaccinated, because they're saying they want to assert their right not to be vaccinated and put others at risk in the workplace. And that's just not acceptable when we're dealing with the lethal virus. So ultimately, it's not having them come to work if they have no lawful human rights exemption. And is it temporary? Perhaps. I don't think COVID's going away in the next 3 months, but one never knows. And you'll have to manage that with care. Another problem, of course, is if you're in an industry with labor shortages, you may be reluctant to impose a mandatory proof of vaccine policy because you might have 5 or 10 or maybe even a higher percentage of your employees who are committed anti-vaxxers that don't want to work with your concern about workplace safety. That'll be problematic. It would be nice if some of the unions in the industry would take a position on supporting employer mandatory proof of vaccines, but as far as I'm aware, no union has yet done so. So that's certainly something that the association can talk to the unions about on a more global basis than on an individual contractor basis. But it seems to me that since we're still in and see a cresting of the fourth wave, and by the way, if you track the data daily like you'll see that the fourth wave already that we're in now has higher number of cases in Ontario than the first wave. Now, the percentage of deaths are lower, but the number of people on the average 7-day average rate today is 701 cases, new COVID cases per day. Whereas at the peak of the first wave, back in last March and April of 2020, the peak was 510 cases in the province. So the fourth wave has already surpassed the first wave. It might be cresting as high as the second wave, depending on the behavior of Ontarians, the willingness to get vaccinated, and potentially the risk of further lockdowns.
Great.
Sorry, Stephen, any other questions quickly before we wrap up?
Sure, just a couple. So, and I think you've answered a few. So has LIUNA taken a position on mandatory vaccination policy? Not that we're aware of, although some of the executives may have publicly supported vaccination policies. The union itself has not taken a public position. And I don't think we'll get to all of them, but we'll certainly circle back to everybody who did have questions. One of them is, will we be receiving a policy template? Yes, to everyone in the chat, I have just provided a link to the vaccination policy template. So please click on that and download it. Okay, so just, and I'll just pick a couple here. So Norm, what duty to accommodate does an employer have to an employee whose spouse or other dependents may be immune compromised?
Right. Well, I mean, this is a interesting and not so hard question to answer. If you've got somebody at your workplace that has a vulnerable member of their family at home and they're not vaccinated, I can only say it's morally reprehensible for that individual to actually not be vaccinated. So that doesn't really relate to the employer's duty to keep the workplace safe, but is a further reason for mandatory proof of vaccine policy. I mean, why wouldn't your employee want to get vaccinated if somebody at home has dementia, is morbidly obese, and has diabetes, has asthma? And so you can find very easily on Health Canada website the 15 comorbidity risk factors to be more susceptible to getting an adverse health outcome or death from COVID. If somebody has one or more of those risk factors at home and your worker is going to home and then coming to work and is not vaccinated, I can only shake my head and say they are reckless beyond polite language. That's a perfect example why employers need to think about a mandatory proof of vaccine policy. It's more than just the worker's safety. It's their family safety. It's the community safety. So yeah, I'm not sure if I've missed the question, but if somebody at home is more adversely affected by the risk of COVID transmission, all the more reason to have a mandatory proof of vaccine policy at work. To me, that's a simple answer.
Perfect. No, I think that certainly answered the question. And so just so everybody knows, this webinar will be available on our YouTube channel. We'll include it in our next member bulletin, so please look out for that. I wanted to take the opportunity again to thank Norm Keith of KPMG Law for being so generous with his time and all the work that he did to develop this vaccination policy template. I think Norm, on behalf of the association, thank you for all your hard work on this. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Stephen. Just a couple of wrap-up thoughts. We're going to have to learn to live with COVID. The doctors and the medical experts are saying it's not going away anytime soon. So the question is, how can you as an employer be as responsible and safety focused as you can? And one, but not all of your COVID safety plan issues should be a mandatory proof of vaccine policy. You're going to have a bumpy ride with some employees, and other employees may exercise their right to refuse to do unsafe work with somebody who's not vaccinated. Being calm, understanding that there are divergent views while still moving ahead with a clear and fair and safety-focused policy is the best way through it. But again, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me, give me a call, send me an email. I'll do my best to help. And best of luck and success as we move into a fall with managing this risk for your workers.
Great. Thank you, everyone.